5, and we're looking forward to welcoming Bruce Douglas back to Potomac Presbyterian Church. Bruce is familiar to many of us here in the room and online, as he's been coming and teaching classes here for a good maybe 15, 20 years, I think.
30 years. So.
Seriously? Seriously?
Yeah.
30 years. Okay.
I think it was in the 90s when I came here. So.
Wow. Okay. Okay. Well, so even though Bruce has been coming and teaching here for 30 years, I'm going to read a few things about Bruce so that we are reminded of his background and what he brings with him in his teaching. He is an emeritus professor at the Department of Government at Georgetown University and has been chair of that department as well as dean of the faculty at Georgetown. Bruce has a Master of Divinity from Yale and his PhD in political science from Duke. He's an elder at Lewinsville Presbyterian Church in McLean, not active on the session right now, but his wife Betty is active on the session right now at Lewinsville. And Bruce is the founder and organizer of the Reformed Institute and is now director of emeritus of that organization. Bruce is a longtime friend of this congregation, as has been said, and Bruce has been a source of support and encouragement for me in my ministry over the years. Amen. I like to think that Bruce is a model for what an elder can and does do in the church, in the way that he shared his vocation, his gift of teaching with congregations, and is able to share his love for the church and church history with congregations as well as with his own congregation of which he's a member. So for the next 3 weeks, Bruce will lead us in an exploration of the foundations of Reformed political thought and how in politics, the Protestants who identified themselves as Reformed shaped current events even unfolding today. So I'm going to open us with a word of prayer and then turn it over to Bruce. Good and gracious God, you are Lord of all time, Lord of the universe. And we thank you that we can gather in this way and learn from reformers, from those who have helped to shape the tradition that we find ourselves a part of today. I pray that as Bruce teaches and leads us in understanding more fully our ancestry, our religious heritage, that you would guide us in the way that you know is right and good and true for ourselves and for this community of your people, that you would use us to better your world and use us to understand who you are and how we are meant to be in the world. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Amen. Right.
Well, thank you, Emily, for that very gracious introduction. Just a word about the experience I've had in teaching, as I did for 45 years at Georgetown. Retired in 2018, but I was on the faculty there for 45 years, teaching mainly the history of political ideas. And I had the experience there of becoming more conscious of the fact that I was a Protestant. I want to underscore that. This was the first Catholic institution I'd ever been in. You know, cradle Presbyterian, raised a Presbyterian, and by the way, I never heard of John Calvin until I went to college. Isn't that interesting? Mm-hmm. All those Presbyterian events that I went to as a kid never had any mention. Interesting. So at Georgetown, I encounter just a Catholic institution, but a Jesuit institution, of course, and that's a very particular kind of Catholic. If there are former Catholics in the room, you will testify to that. So I'm there, and I was treated very well, and I was comfortable there. I liked it there, but I became more and more conscious over time that I'm one thing and they're something else. And it led me to think more seriously about my Protestant identity than I'd ever thought before. That is not an uncommon experience. If you're kind of an outsider in a given place, and a lot of times it triggers thoughts in your mind. And so I really became more informed about my own tradition as a result of that experience. And I would be asked, not infrequently, not so much in the classroom as in, administrative gatherings or faculty gatherings and so forth. Well, what do you think as a protestant? Are you still protesting? So then and on the fly, you have to sort of answer those questions, and sometimes very informally. You go to lunch with somebody, and it's been my experience in professional life that people don't talk about their religious identity unless pressed. It's a very interesting thing. It's almost like there's a wall there. But some people knew as the years went by that I was this protestant, and that I was maybe interested in these questions, about what it means to be a Protestant and so forth. And so occasionally, not very often, but occasionally somebody would say, I hear that the Presbyterians have a very distinctive way of organizing the church. Can you tell me about that? Jesuits would say. So, and so then I would, fortunately, as the years went by, I got sufficiently learned to be able to answer those questions. And I'll tell you, sometimes when you answered the questions, there were other questions. It was like a little door had been opened, and I remember one Jesuit one time saying, there are a lot of things that the Catholic Church can learn from the Presbyterians, and I just sat there. I want to say just a word or two about a concept that I will be throwing around in this conversation a lot, and that's tradition. I'm talking about in this series, started it last year on Zoom, and I'm going to be continuing it this year. Talking about the Reformed tradition with respect to its political aspect, mainly. It has many aspects. Well, what is a tradition? I think that's a very important thing to think about in the following way. I think a tradition is two things. And I think all of us, to some extent, have this in our own lives. We experience what I'm about to say. A tradition is, first of all, an inheritance. Something which is passed down to us. There are family traditions, there are institutional traditions, there are, on and on. Something that's passed down, and usually we think of tradition as something that people want to hold on to. They cherish. Not all. There's always a debate about what to hold on to. But so you've got an inheritance that comes to you from the past, and then the other thing about traditions, always, even when they're really resisting it, is they have to change. They have to change because new circumstances arise. Even if I'm convinced that my forebears just got it absolutely right, I'm living in a different time and place, to put it mildly. So I have to relate what I inherit to this new circumstance, and that's how traditions develop. Sometimes in spite of enormous resistance. So what I'm doing in this set of talks is now really getting to the change part. Last year, I'm under no illusions about you remembering. I'll give you the cliff notes real quick. But it at least is something that I put on the table, even if you're not on the tip of your consciousness. Last year, what I tried to do was talk about the foundation period. Of course, the Protestant Reformation is where it all gets started. And I said last year that there's about a 150-year period in which the foundations are laid, foundations of Reformed Protestant political thought. And I meant by that the following: these people were making it up. You know, they really, what the Reformation is about, when you think about it, is kind of reinvention of the Christian religion. It really is. Not total reinvention, but huge amount of change. You know, in liturgy, in polity, and in theology, and personal ethics. I mean, just think, for example, just one aside here. Just think, for example, what a difference it has made that Protestants said divorce is legitimate. Catholics technically don't still believe it. And you can just see the ramifications of that in law in countries where, well, you see what I'm getting. So there was this huge process of rethinking in the light of what they thought was a very initially a very simple idea. Let's go to the Bible. They're recovering the Bible. They're putting the Bible in the hands of ordinary people, but more broadly, they're sort of going back to the Bible and saying, because they're convinced that something has gone wrong in the Roman Catholic development of these things, and they're trying to recover what has been lost and cut away all the stuff which is extraneous. And they're in the process, they're trying to reinvent what Christianity is, based, they think, solely on the Bible. Now, I think it's got to be more complicated than that, but that was the basic idea. So we're reinventing Christianity in the light of that principle. And it just was an enormous change for obvious reasons, all kinds of stuff. Just let me go into one. The Catholics had 7 sacraments. My guess is nobody in the room can name them. That's not an insult. It's just 7. I'll bet she can. Maybe she can. I don't know. She's one of the learned pastors. But you know, as a result of this kind of rethinking, 2 sacraments: baptism, Holy Communion, just that. Now, if you're a good Catholic living in the 16th century, what are they doing? And then, of course, married priests, just, you know, what are they doing? So, what happens at the time of the Reformation is very quickly, I mean, like within 3 or 4 years, if we say the Reformation starts with the iconic posting of those theses, 1517, literally by 1520, there's a splintering that takes place. I mean, so it's so fast, it almost takes your breath away. Within just a very few years, the people who are followers of this idea that Martin Luther has, that we need to rethink things, they start having differences of opinion about what Scripture teaches. And by the way, Luther was shocked by it. Talk about naive. I mean, he's a great man, but his thought was that if everybody just looked at the Bible, that it would be very clear how things should be redone. I mean, here we are 500 years later with, you know, it's, at any rate, what happened at the beginning was very quickly a split in 3 ways. Later, there were umpty splits. There were three key positions. The radicals, the true radicals in the Reformation are people called Anabaptists. And Luther, they just make Luther's blood boil. He thought they were heretics for all kinds of reasons, and he did not like what they were doing, what they read into Scripture. That's what he did. So you have Lutherans who follow Luther. You have Anabaptists, who you might say are the left wing of the Reformation, the radicals, who say we've got to throw out all kinds of things. And then you have, in the middle, these people called Reformed. And they really are in the middle. The word Reformed is a boast, literally a boast. You know, we're more Reformed than you are. But they really could say that only in relation to the Lutherans, who were more conservative. They could not say that in relation to the Anabaptists. At any rate, by the 1520s, 1530s, you got Reformed already. And they're already, you know, quarreling and dividing and so forth. And then ever since, Anglicans and Methodists and you name it. So we're talking about the Reformed tradition, which comes out of a series of German-speaking city-states in southern part of the Holy Roman Empire and Switzerland. That's where it is. Let me say that again. You get just a nice little sort of part of Western Europe, German-speaking initially, and Swiss or Holy Roman Empire, just a few cities. And by the way, that's very important because our version of the Reformation always emerged in self-governing cities. That's politically very important. Not in big nation states, not in empires, but in city-states with their peculiar communal politics, like the canton of Geneva, the canton of Zurich, etc. I hope you have certain images forming in your mind. Now, the fascinating thing about these people, among other things, is the following. They had an appetite for politics that was unique. And they all were almost driven to it, but it wasn't just that. Calvin said in a very, very kind of strong statement, he said, politics is not a polluted thing. It is of God. Now, why would he say it's not a polluted thing? Well, because the Anabaptists said it was a polluted thing. You know, like, if you're going to be a good Christian, keep your hands away off of that. And by the way, there's still echoes of that to this day. I grew up in a kind of a pietistic Presbyterian church, United Presbyterian Church, actually, where the thought of somebody being involved in politics was, nobody quite said it, but it certainly was not encouraged. It was not part of the way people thought about righteousness. In the Reformed tradition, initially, there is this very strong statement by Calvin, who says, the exercise of civil authority is a calling, and not only is it a calling, but it is a sacred ministry. You cannot be more elevated than you're talking about. And by the way, the Roman Catholics saw immediately, that's a problem. That guy's a problem. Because he's kind of like us in what he's saying about it. But you can imagine that a certain kind of person is attracted to that. And it's no accident that suddenly you've got in all these city-states people who say, well, I'm supposed to be involved in politics. I'm supposed to be involved in, and they were. And so they became, and I want to say that they developed an appetite for power. And by the way, I'm not, that's not a criticism at all. There are some people and some movements that are attracted to power and are comfortable with power. Reformed people have been historically very comfortable with power. Anabaptists are not. They think it's kind of dangerous. Lutherans, And by the way, not only did they have an appetite for power, but they had an appetite for doing good things with power. That's part of the elevated notion here. It's not just that we've got to have politics. No. It's created by God in order that we can do good things, virtuous things, righteous things. So, and then what happens is when they move out from these city-states into the west towards nation-states. Everybody with me? From city-states to nation-states, heading into France, heading into Scotland, heading into England, and what the Low Countries that become Netherlands and Belgium and so forth. As they move in that way, there's a fight. Because in all those nation states, in contrast to city states where they got power real quickly, there is a huge Catholic resistance. A huge Catholic resistance. And it comes very often from the top, from the monarch. And what do you get? Religious wars. Religious wars in France, religious wars in the Netherlands, what becomes the Netherlands, religious war in Scotland, religious war in England. Now, I hope you're with me here. It's that missionary effort to reform big nation states that produces this conflict. And one of the striking things, and now I'm getting to the key theme of this talk. One of the things that happens is that they are confronted very quickly with the question. We're getting slaughtered, literally. We're getting killed here. We're getting the monarchy in country after country is trying to suppress us violently. And what are we going to do? Are we going to fight back? Are we going to raise arms? Now, the issue of legitimacy of political resistance was at the center of the conversation among these people in the beginning, the foundation period, for just the reason I suggested. And they produce an amazing flood of treatises. I mean, really top tier treatises. This is what I studied for a living. You know, this sort of serious political ideas. And you have in the Reformed tradition in this period, at least a dozen works. I'm not going to bore you with the names. Most of them are Latin, by the way. But just an aside on that. Why Latin? Because Latin is the language that enables people across these linguistic divisions to communicate. It was the English of the day. So if you were going to communicate in a serious way, Latin. Calvin writes in Latin, Zwingli writes in Latin, etc. So they produced these treatises, and the treatises are just amazing in terms of their quality, but about half of those treatises are about this question. Is it right to take up arms and maybe even murder other people? Maybe even murder the king in the name of right religion? Now, I hope you sense why that's a tough question. And here, let me turn the screw a little bit further here. Why it's a really tough question. These are people who claim to be getting their politics out of the Bible. Getting their politics out of the Bible. And they're Christians. And there's a long tradition of Christian thought, not universal, but very heavy weight on it, that when Christians are confronted with the sword, what they are supposed to do is grin and take it. Don't resist. And there's a famous passage in Romans 13, that sort of nails this down. Be subject to those authorities, even if it's a tyrant, even if it's a really bad ruler, even if it's the punishment of the front row.
Yeah.
So there's a whole tradition. And by the way, these are very righteous people. These are super righteous people and learned people. They study the Bible, and here they're looking at all of that stuff and the Gospels. The Gospel. How do you get resistance out of the Gospel? Well, here's how they got it, and they got it. And by the way, this is such a fascinating issue. When you say turn to the Bible for guidance in politics, which part? I hope you will pick that up today as the lesson for today, among other things. That was one of those, because in the Bible, you find a whole series of different kinds of texts. The Gospels, Paul's letters, the historical books of the Old Testament, poetry there, with some politics in there. There's the book of Revelation. Those are at least 5 possibilities. All of those have at one point or another been picked up by some Christian group trying to get guidance on politics and emphasize. Our spiritual forebears in this period turned to historical books of the Old Testament. They were almost ignoring the New Testament, believe it or not. They went to the historical books of the Old Testament as the foundation of their political thought. Now, I want to tell you, that's pretty rich stuff if you look at it. I mean, you've got this story. I haven't got time to go into much detail here, but you've got this fascinating story of Israel being constituted as a people. Then gradually, not immediately, wanting to get a king. Remember that? And God is not terribly happy about it. God is not terribly enthusiastic about it. God is not, at least we're told, God doesn't turn a smiling face on that possibility. Why? Because kings are sources of all kinds of apostasy, all kinds of bad things. Corrupting influence is sort of, the more powerful the king, that's there in the story. And then, of course, you get the next part of this is they get a king, and the kings tend to do precisely what the critics said they would do. And there's all this stuff from the prophets about, see, and you could read that as what anti-monarchical, or at least anti-absolutist, which was the big political theory of the time, concentrate power in the king. Think of Henry VIII. So they turn to the Old Testament, the historical books, and find there, and it's pretty clear that there are places where this is exactly what happens. You have a bad king whose behavior elicits resistance, opposition from righteous people. Hmm? Ahab, Jezebel, we got all kinds of. So they look at that and they say, well, that's probably God's will for us right now. Now, the Old Testament is not exactly a pacifist book. So here you've got for people who, and by the way, they think, and keep in mind, a lot of the people who are doing this are not clergy. They are very well-educated, well-appointed lay people, like nobles in France, who are way, way up on the political food chain, and they've got all kinds of stake in this. And it's not just spiritual stake. They've got, and some of them are so close to the king that there's even a thought that maybe we could ultimately win at court and create a Protestant country. You can imagine the appetite for that. Calvin dies, by the way, just as that is beginning to emerge. I've oftentimes thought, 1564, I oftentimes thought, boy, wouldn't that have been interesting if he had lived to see these religious wars that erupt. So now I'm winding up here to throw a punch. What happens is not only do they develop justifications for military activities, what it is, insurrection, that's really what it is, seizing power, that's what it is, that they come to be known as, I love this characterization, our spiritual forebears were known initially as very rebellious people. Rebellious types. So just when you hear some kind of offhand put down about Calvinists or Reformed or so forth as being stodgy, boring, just tell the person who makes that comment to read a little history. These people were the rebels of their day. I mean, quite literally. And a lot of times the result was a bloodletting. These religious wars that they rarely won. Now that I'm tempted to say, and now we're going to talk about, but we're not, because I'm winding up, and here comes. Now, with that as background, I want to jump to two developments that take place in the period that I'm going to characterize as the second phase of the development of the Reformed political tradition. And that is the 18th and 19th centuries, the 1700s and the 1800s. Now, it's so fascinating to me that after this season of religious wars that eventually got so terrible that people you can just read people pleading for peace. Please stop it. The beginning of arguments for toleration. Late 17th century into the 18th century, people are starting to say, please, can't we just stop this killing one another in the name of God? But then, fascinating, jump forward, even just about 100 years, the late 1700s, you're into another season of violence, this time more secular. And that is the American Revolution and the French Revolution. I want to talk briefly about both. And here's a question that I think frames what is the subject of this whole presentation this morning. How would somebody who had been formed in this Reformed story that I've been in this tradition with the story I've just laid out, how would somebody who's been formed and knows about that react to a struggle for independence among the British colonies on this side of the Atlantic? 1760s, 1770s, 1780s. And I think probably you can guess where they would go. Now let me just say a word here about the sort of the religious situation in the period of the American founding. We're now talking about everybody quick. We're talking about the American founding, the founding of the American Republic, independence followed by that. The people who were the main actors in public life in that great struggle were Congregationalists, Presbyterians, and some Anglicans. Presbyterians, Congregationalists, and some Anglicans. The Anglicans were deeply divided about the issues I'm about to get into. There were Baptists, but they tended to be less interested in the sort of total package of issues they were interested in religious liberty, full stop. That's an important issue, but it's not the whole thing. Now, it's so interesting to me to observe. The Presbyterians were primarily initially in the middle colonies. New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Southern New York, that's our roots. First Presbyterian Church, First Presbytery, right there. I don't think it's any accident that the first, you might say, great Presbyterian educational institution was right there, the College of New Jersey, Princeton. Yeah. Presbyterians were so much on the side of independence, take control of our own lives, get those English out of here. There was so much on that one side that the English complained about this being a Presbyterian conspiracy. Now, that's a little too simple because there were plenty of Congregationalists, but they're Reformed. That's another version of Reformed Protestantism. The Congregationalists and the Presbyterians together were almost in lockstep on this issue. We want to get the Brits out. I said the Anglicans are divided for obvious reasons. Now, some of them were very sympathetic to the cause, as it was called. By the way, there's a wonderful book that I came across recently on this whole period that I commend to you, almost as required reading. It would be required reading of this work. Joseph Ellis, The Cause. Go get a copy and read it. You will, when you read that book, you will say, I didn't know that. Like every page. And this is about the period of the founding. And it's well written. Joseph Ellis, The Cause. Background reading for what I'm talking about here. I'm going to talk briefly about the main man in the Presbyterian story in the colonies. John Witherspoon. How many have heard of John Witherspoon? It's pretty good. It's pretty good. Pretty good. Well, we'll go on to the 200 level. All right, John Witherspoon, Scot. That's significant in this story. He's a Scot. His arm had to be twisted to come over to become, right in the middle of his career, very successful ministerial career. His arm had to be twisted to come over to assume the presidency of the College of New Jersey at a time when it was not in a good condition. It was bankrupt. It was not being well maintained. I find it hard to understand how Presbyterians could allow that to happen. Presbyterians, I mean, maybe Methodists, but not. I mean, how many bankers were on the committee that allowed that to happen? At any rate, so he comes over here, learned man, and he becomes in very quick order. First of all, he puts the financial circumstances of the College of New Jersey into a good place in a period of less than a decade, and that's as the sort of the momentum is building for the war. My goodness, I've seen a couple of college presidents in my time, and I feel my guess is that he was out of raising money a lot of the time. But that was only one thing. He was very active in public affairs. He was an elected delegate to the legislature of the colony in New Jersey. He becomes part of the Continental Congress. He then becomes the signer of the Declaration of Independence, the only clergyman who was the signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was by far the most prominent Presbyterian and one of the most prominent clergy in that whole period. And he was foursquare on the side of, first of all, his position of all. Now, he's a Scot, and you understand the Scots and the English. You have some sense of that. He, right from the get-go, almost as soon as he's landed and got to the College of New Jersey, he's beginning to think that the taxes that are being imposed by London are unfair. So the first issue, he's already on the side of the colonies with respect to, we've got to have those taxes. By the way, the other thing about him that just amazes me is he was rather gifted in the field of political economy, and he wrote a book on secure money. I mean, amazing. Where did he get the time? At any rate, he was of a generation of clergy who would oftentimes have an expertise in something quite separate from their own direct ministerial. And by the way, when he got to the Continental Congress, he served on committees that had to do a lot with finance because of this knowledge. So he is, first of all, just a proponent of pushback on the tax issue. Draws the conclusion very quickly, not immediately, but very quickly, they're not going to give. And so therefore, next conclusion, independence. Independence. Independence is and he kept saying, is a just cause. And he said that, and by the way, if you went to a Presbyterian meeting and there were, the whole Presbyterian apparatus was developing in this period, you'd probably hear a lot of that kind of stuff. Because they were on one side. I'm a little amused when occasionally I hear some Presbyterians saying, we don't want any politics in our church. I mean, they were born in a kind of political partisanship, total partisanship. By the way, the College of New Jersey was targeted by the English for really bad treatment, precisely because of Witherspoon's role. They used the chapel, for example, as a barn. It was pretty bad, and they burned some buildings and so forth. So, and then finally, his position was so he was quite clear. We need to do all we can to raise the troops, and get that war prosecuted. He was a critic of George Washington. He thought George Washington was not a very good general. He thought it was a bad strategically. I picked that up in that book, The Cause. It's just really fascinating to think about. And apparently was outspoken in his criticism of Washington and wasn't alone in it. He recognized that Washington was a sort of noble figure who was a great symbolic, he had some questions about his military judgment. And then once they got independence, the obvious next question was, how strong are you? Articles of Confederation versus the Constitution. Constitution represented a stronger federal system. He was completely in favor of that. So we've got here somebody who is, I would say, a good son of those people back in the previous centuries who said it is entirely appropriate. Indeed, some of them even said it is your duty to take up arms. But the difference here is they're not so much in the case of the American struggle for independence. They're struggling for independence, not the triumph of right religion. As a matter of fact, Witherspoon was a strong proponent of the separation of church and state. Interestingly enough, while at the same time insisting upon a vital role for religion in public. You understand the difference? Separation, no established church. Because he felt the established church would be the church of England. And he was adamantly opposed to that and thought that, and then, by the way, that's really the sort of the common line at that time. We don't want to have established churches, but we want to have protection for religious people, that is religious liberty, if you will, to express their views and be active in public. French Revolution. And so by and large, Reformed Christians, Reformed Protestants looked at the American Revolution and said, go for it. Just cause, righteous cause. There were even some of them who said liberty, understood in a complex way, liberty is a righteous cause. Very much to the Reformed approach to politics, a righteous cause. It was very hard to be a Presbyterian or a Congregationalist, for that matter, in this period, and being on the side of being opposed to the struggle for independence. Very hard to do that. You could do it, but it would be very hard. Now, within just a very short period of time, you have, of course, another revolution. As a matter of fact, it's so interesting. But finally, the Constitution the Americans come to agreement about the Constitution around the end of the 1780s, and precisely at that moment, you get this explosion in France, the French Revolution. Now, to state the obvious, and the trade on the knowledge that all of us have here about the French Revolution, vast subject, but I think we all have certain impressions. It was a very different kind of revolution. One way to put the difference is to say this: the American Revolution was a political revolution. It was not really a social revolution. You see the difference? The French Revolution was an assault virtually on the whole way of life. Religion, just a sort of massive attack on the position of the Catholic Church in France. Massive attack on privileged wealth, which of course you didn't have in the same way in the colony. And literally an attempt to reconstitute the way of life of the French people, and to do it, of course, rather directly from the political center. It involved, summarizing very quickly, an enormous sort of phenomenon, and that is, it involved very quickly mob violence. And the word mob, I think, is the appropriate one here. So that's just kind of a surge of passion, which is rather disorganized. Just a surge of passion, which is rather disorganized. A lot of mob violence, which morphed into terror. We had the terror of the French Revolution in the 1790s, which was a grim thing, which then morphed into a dictatorship. A dictatorship which, in some respects, was a sort of reconstitution of the thing which was being rebelled against, which was an absolute monarchy. And another thing, the French Revolution had a very strong secularist tendency. It was anti-clerical, to be sure, which meant anti-priest, sort of organized religion as it was known in France. Keep in mind that the Protestants had been marginalized in brutal ways to try to eliminate their presence in France. But the French Revolution, among other things, was dedicated to the constitution of French life on a new religious basis, the religion of reason, the Enlightenment. Or, as some people might say today, a more consistently secularist way of life. Now, it will not surprise you that Reformed Protestants tended to react to this very differently. Very different. They were not positive, except for a very brief period right at the beginning, when all the good stuff was happening. You saw this revolt of the you've seen Les Miserables. You know what that was about. A sort of uprising of the desperately poor against this privilege and so forth, an attempt to right things in that sense. At the beginning, therefore, there was a sense that this is great, and especially on this side of the Atlantic. People said, "Yeah, this," and our spiritual forebears, "Yeah, this is good. This is maybe even righteous." But very quickly, that attitude changed, and I want to stress, that attitude changed despite the fact that in a very limited sense, the French Revolution was a real opening for French Protestants. Let me explain that. In the period before the Revolution, before the French Revolution, there had been a systematic effort on the part of the monarchy for literally almost a century to try to destroy Protestants, persecution of the worst kind. There may be people in this room who are descended from Huguenots. I don't know, but occasionally when I'm giving a talk, I can just see somebody nodding because they know about the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day and all that kind of stuff. Well, where basically the message to Protestants for I think about 100 years was initially you can stay, but you're not going to have any role in public life, sort of marginalization. And then repression, just brutal repression, taking away all the liberties you they had initially come to hope for. The clear aim was to drive them out, drive them to some other place, or prevent them from having any real voice, any presence in public life. That was the solution to the religious wars of France. So when the revolution comes, the French Revolution comes, those systems of oppression imposed upon Protestants are removed. And you might say at the beginning, that's great. Except for the fact that what remained was an effort to marginalize anything that having had to do with a Christian influence in public life, including the kind that they would bring. And of course, their numbers were very small. So, to summarize, and then add a quick note here, there was a very different reaction to the French Revolution as it unfolded. And the best illustration of that is a man who is another one of the key figures in the whole history of Reformed Protestantism in this period. And that's a Dutchman named Abraham Kuyper. Kuyper, extraordinary man, another one. He was like Witherspoon, when did he sleep? He was a man who was a pastor in the Dutch Reformed Church, scholar, academic, politician, who ultimately became the prime minister of the Netherlands. My goodness. But one of the most interesting things about him was as his political career was just beginning to develop in the 1860s and 70s and so forth, he's looking at the consequences of the French Revolution in the Netherlands. And keep in mind, it had sort of ripple effects in many different places. And they were consistently, from his point of view, secularizing, trying to, as much as possible, drive religious influences out of public life. He was opposed to that. And as a result, not the only reason, but as a result, in part of his conviction, the party that he created was called the Anti-Revolutionary Party. The Anti-Revolutionary Party. Now, the fascinating thing about this is a party which basically is, if you would look at the program today, you say this is a very progressive party. But on this one issue of sort of, does religion have a place in public life? And by the way, he was not at all a proponent of an established church, which existed in the Netherlands, and he was a critic of that. But he, particularly in education, he thought it was entirely appropriate for religious influences to be actively present, and there was the party that he was opposing was opposed to that. So Kuyper, and by the way, Kuyper then, just to complete the sort of notes here, Kuyper then gave a series of very interesting lectures at Princeton, invited at, it's sort of, to bring this all together, at Princeton, lectures on Calvinism, given right at the turn of the century, at which he praised the good revolutions and attacked the bad ones. And you can guess which the good ones were. They were revolutions, as he said, of a certain kind. Moderate, balanced, respectful of liberties, as opposed to what? Those other ones, especially, but it wasn't just France, it was a whole series of revolutions that had been bubbling up in Western Europe, which he thought he came pretty close to saying the work of the devil. He didn't quite say it, but he came real close to that. Now, I hope you see what's going on. This story that I've been telling you is a kind of course correction from the point of view of people who like the outcome. Kuyper, and I think Witherspoon had he lived, but Kuyper in particular does say, I do believe strongly that sometimes resistance and rebellion are necessary. Indeed, they are the right thing for people to do. And they need to take that action. But there are right ways and wrong ways to do that. And we need, therefore, to have a more complicated way of thinking about this problem of resistance. Now, last point, and then I'll invite your comments and questions. I think this is a very good illustration of how traditions develop. The guys back in the day had not experienced quite the French Revolution. They hadn't seen that. Once you see the French Revolution, And by the way, I'm personally not about to say uniformly that the French Revolution was a bad thing. That's a complicated issue. But once you have that experience, it complicates your thinking at the very least. It complicates your thinking, and I think requires you to have, coming out of that experience, a more, shall we say, discriminating view on the basic issue. Let me stop. Emily has told me that we stop at 1:45. We've got 8 minutes. Floor's open. Rebuttals, questions. Is it clear what I'm saying? Yeah.
I have a question that may not be the appropriate time and place to discuss, but it seems like early on, the focus on a religious foundation of this country is coming back in a popular way with Christian nationalism. Is that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. But understand, it is I think you used the word populist, didn't you? Populist, did you say?
Yeah, populist or.
Yeah, I think populist is the word. And I think that is, well, the answer to your question is yes.
All right, well, then you take another question.
But please don't identify Christian nationalism as we see it manifested with the thought of Witherspoon or Kuyper, either one, because they're more complicated and I would say nuanced thinkers. At any rate, I'm tempted to give a long speech and I'm not going to do it.
We thank you.
By the way, the topics for the next 2 weeks are, I'm going to talk about democracy next week, the emergence of the democratic idea in this period. This is when democracy really begins to become a serious possibility in our sense. And then nationalism. I'm going to talk about nationalism in the third of the talks, and there more specifically. I think I'm going to get to what you're inviting me to. It's tempting, but I'm not going to do it.
Yeah, okay. Just to kind of follow on to that question and what you talked about. You know, you mentioned the French Revolution was very secular and oriented.
Mhm.
You know, the poor against the rich, and it didn't end well. I mean, it was maybe a good thing that it happened to some extent, but it didn't end well. The American Revolution, you kind of hinted that, not more than hinted, but indicated that there's a lot of Reformed Christian thought that went in and was active in the American Revolution Rebellion, but not in a way that would say, okay, I want to replace other things. You got to think my way about everything. It was a recognition of liberty, free thinking, in supporting other ideas, but very much, as I may be overemphasizing this, but from the Bible, Reformed thinking of the Bible, liberty for all, but not one way of thought. And there's a tendency sometimes today, and we even see it to some extent, I think, in the churches, the way the churches, even the Presbyterian churches have, where there's a feeling that, you know, yes, Reformed, I believe these things. By the way, there's a temptation to feel that those beliefs should be very specific beliefs imposed on all, as opposed to accepting other interpretations of the Bible or of what we're trying to accomplish. And that gets back to the whole power thing. You know, when I get into a powerful position, I'm kind of tempted to say, well, you know, I've thought a lot about this and I really think I'm right. And therefore, I think you all should adopt to my way of thinking, as opposed to saying, I can think these things, but keep a level of humility to the fact that others may have some views that should be respected and important as well. So I'm kind of blurring a few things. A lot of things that go on in churches that we've seen, but at the same time, things that were very much imposed during the unique experience of the American Revolution in terms of thought, belief in God, but at the same time, a respect for other ideas and not saying my way or the highway.
Well, I agree and I don't. Let me just offer one thought here, and this is the kind of thing which adult education is frustrating because it's 1 hour.
Mhm.
But here, you and I could probably go for a long time on this, but I'm just gonna say, if you read The Cause, that book, you in particular, I think would really enjoy it. What you discover, it is a cause, that's the funny thing, you know, they don't even use the word independence or republic, the cause. And kind of the idea is get with the program or get out of the way. And if that means leave the town or leave the country, leave. And they felt that was necessary. Now, these are the people who are making the, you know, making the struggle. Now, that's not quite respect for other points of view and so forth. It's we've got the right position here and you are wrong. Now, Ellis says that at least on the political agenda for the making of the war, the execution of the war, not so much the later stuff, was essential to their success. That's one thing. And then we had one other thing to sort of soften that. I think what's so fascinating about the American case, in contrast to the French, is what you basically have is 13, maybe 12, 13 different local resistance movements. And they're different. You know, the people in Virginia are not the same as the people in Maryland, are not the same as the people as whatever. And the great challenge in turn of making a union was bringing them together for some degree of collaboration. And that was very difficult. I mean, toward the end of Ellis's book, he just sort of hints at that problem. Now, you see, that is compatible and indeed even conforms to what you're saying, because just as a political matter, quite apart from what I really think is a matter of principle, if you're from New York and I'm from Virginia, I've got to accommodate you to some extent and vice versa. Otherwise, this thing is not going to hold together. It's not, maybe not even come together. I mean, by the way, that's the problem for slavery. I hope you understand. That's what the slavery was the great compromise. You know, and I think it's pretty clear. By the way, I heard a fascinating talk recently about from somebody who said, you know, maybe it would have been better if the Union itself didn't happen. That you would have had two countries, in effect, one anti-slavery and the other pro-slavery. Right? I think the people who sort of struck that deal were quite aware that that's kind of what was in stake. What was at stake? In order to get them together and keep them together, they had to make, I think, a terrible compromise, but it was a compromise on that problem. Now that's a little bit that's not a benign illustration of live and let live, but that is sort of indicative of the flavor of the situation. Yes, sir.
I have a very simple question. At what point did Latin slip away as being the language of the learned?
Well, I'm gonna. This is good. I'm getting stuff here that's gonna feed into later what I'm gonna talk about later. I think it's related to nationalism. Because nationalism is very much promoted by vernacular language. I hope you see, and it's right the spirit we're talking about here, where people and it's related to the Reformation. Because if you say, let's translate the Bible into the vernacular, okay, which language? So you start thinking of yourself as somebody who is an English speaking, an English reading. I hope you see it's not too far removed and say, we English people, we're special. And I think, by the way, the Roman Catholics have been very consistent and very kind of insightful in attacking. They said, as this whole vernacular Bible thing was getting going, well, we're just splintering the culture. Eventually, we're going to have even more pronounced splintering than we've already known with Latin being available. So, anyway, it's a very interesting topic. I am gonna get to it.
I guess it was a former high school Latin student for a couple of years.
Well, I am too. I am too. I very much enjoy my two teenage grandchildren, and we've talked about this. And they're very gentle with me. But, you know, for one thing, I think people understand the structure of language generally better by studying Latin. And I think that tends to make for better writing. But my grandson's response to that is better by what stands. So I saw, yeah.
What happened to Kuiper? I grew up in the Dutch Reformed Church, never heard the name.
You didn't.
Never.
Oh, that's like me going through all those years of Presbyterian and never hearing it with Calvin. Well, I don't know, we need to talk about the churches you went to, not about. But understand. I think, I think your identity as a person who's part of a confession, part of a church which has a confession, is enhanced by knowing about people like this. I spoke to a men's group a month or so ago. All good Presbyterians, all, I would say, in the age range represented in this room, put it that way. And they had never heard of Witherspoon. Whole swath of people, not one of them. You know, these are not people who are, these are people who read books. And by the way, once we had this conversation about Witherspoon, I think a lot of people were very interested. Well, what was his view about this? What did he think about slavery? What did he think about that? And I think another way to put it is, I think it embodied for them the terribly abstract ideas that are so much. You hear these words, and then that guy right there. I think he's a perfect example of Calvin's idea that public life, as well as academic life in this case, public life is a calling. Because that's all he saw, all the way down the line. We're out of time.
Yep. Thank you.